Every word Ellie Whitman spoke could spark her mother's fury. Every movement inside that narrow, aging house felt like a test she was destined to fail. And on that particular morning, it began with something so small it almost felt cruel to remember later. She poured the milk just a little too high, the white liquid creeping dangerously close to the rim of the glass. And Dorothy Whitman's eyes sharpened instantly, not with surprise but with satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting for the mistake, and the room tightened, the air growing thick and fragile because Ellie knew that look, knew what followed. And even before Dorothy spoke, Ellie's shoulders subtly pulled inward, her spine bending under years of learned obedience. Because Dorothy never raised her voice anymore, she didn't need to, she had perfected the art of quiet domination. Of sighs heavy with disappointment, of looks that said you are still not enough. And as Ellie reached for a cloth to wipe the spill, her hand trembled, not from clumsiness but from fear drilled into her over decades. Fear that lived in her bones. Fear that whispered, don't anger her, don't question her, don't remind her you exist beyond what she allows. And Dorothy finally spoke, softly, dangerously calm, remarking on how careless habits reflected careless character. How the world punished women who couldn't even manage breakfast properly, and Ellie nodded, always nodded, because nodding kept the peace, nodding shortened the lecture, nodding was survival, and this was how her days began. Not with sunlight or hope, but with inspection, judgment, and the quiet reminder that this house was not a home but a cage disguised as concern. And Ellie moved through her chores carefully, washing dishes that were already clean, folding towels that would be refolded later just to prove they were wrong, dusting shelves that Dorothy would swipe a finger across just to confirm control. And while she worked, Ellie's mind drifted the only place it was safe, out the front window, toward the distant mountains rising beyond the tree line, blue and endless. Places Dorothy never looked at because Dorothy hated anything she couldn't dominate, and Ellie imagined the cool air there, imagined quiet that didn't hum with tension, imagined a life where breathing didn't feel like an act of rebellion. And sometimes, when Dorothy wasn't watching, Ellie allowed herself the smallest acts of defiance, humming a tune under her breath, lingering in front of the mirror for a heartbeat longer than necessary, remembering the girl she used to be before fear taught her to shrink, before childhood warmth hardened into adulthood control, and nights were the worst because silence amplified memory. And lying in her narrow bed, Ellie replayed moments from years ago, friends who had invited her out only to be refused, opportunities quietly dismissed by Dorothy as foolish dreams, suitors discouraged with sharp warnings and subtle sabotage until Ellie learned to stop hoping altogether, until loneliness became familiar, almost comforting, and yet even then, even buried beneath routine and fear. Something stubborn refused to die, a quiet longing for laughter, for sunlight in her own home, for love that didn't come with conditions. And she didn't know then that the mountains she stared at each day were already holding the man who would change everything. That Sam Carter had noticed the woman walking the gravel road each morning with her eyes lowered and her shoulders heavy, had noticed the way she paused as if listening for permission to exist. And on the afternoon, Ellie struggled up the drive with groceries biting into her arms. The sound of boots on gravel startled her so badly she nearly dropped everything. And when she looked up, she didn't see judgment or impatience. She saw calm, steady eyes beneath the brim of a worn hat, and Sam spoke simply, asking if she'd like help, not assuming, not insisting, just offering, and in that pause, longer than it should have been, Ellie felt fear wrestle with something unfamiliar. Something dangerous, hope, and as she nodded and allowed him to take the weight from her arms, she had no idea that this quiet mountain man, this presence unlike any she'd known, was stepping not just into her afternoon, but into the life Dorothy Whitman had spent decades trying to control, and that from this moment on, nothing in that house would ever feel quite as secure again. From the moment Samuel Carter walked back down the gravel road, Ellie Whitman felt something shift inside the house, as if the walls themselves had noticed the intrusion, and Dorothy Whitman certainly had. Because her silence that evening was sharper than any scolding, her movements precise, controlled, the kind of quiet that warned of future punishment, and Ellie moved carefully through dinner, every clink of cutlery echoing louder than it should. Her thoughts drifting back to the way Sam had carried the groceries without comment, without impatience, how he had asked nothing of her except whether she was all right, a question no one had asked her in years, and later that night, lying awake. Ellie replayed the sound of his voice, low and steady, not demanding answers, just existing beside her. And she hated herself a little for it, hated how quickly hope slipped in, because hope had always been dangerous in this house. Hope invited disappointment, hope gave Dorothy something to crush, and the next morning Dorothy wasted no time tightening the reins, reminding Ellie of chores that needed doing, of responsibilities she'd neglected, of neighbors who talked, of dangers lurking in friendliness, casually mentioning that men who lived alone in the mountains were rarely decent, rarely trustworthy, and Ellie felt the familiar shame rise even though Sam had done nothing wrong. And that was Dorothy's greatest skill, planting guilt where none belonged. Yet as the days passed, Sam continued to appear, never crossing lines, never stepping too close, sometimes fixing a fence post, sometimes dropping off apples from a tree higher up the ridge, sometimes just nodding as he passed, and each time Ellie felt seen in a way that unsettled her routine, and Dorothy noticed too, her eyes following Ellie's gaze a second too long. Her questions becoming sharper, asking where Ellie had been, why she lingered outdoors, what exactly the mountain man wanted. And Ellie answered carefully, always carefully, but something inside her had begun to stretch toward the light. And she started inventing reasons to walk farther down the road, to take longer paths through the yard, to stand at the fence just in case Sam appeared. And when he did, one afternoon while clouds gathered low over the mountains, he asked her about the garden, about the way she trimmed the roses even though they never seemed to bloom properly. And Ellie surprised herself by answering honestly, admitting she wasn't sure why she kept tending something that rarely gave anything back, and Sam smiled, not wide, not dramatic, just enough, and said some things take time, some places need patience, some hearts too. And the words settled deep inside her because they weren't advice, they were understanding. And when thunder rolled in the distance, Ellie felt the familiar panic rise. Storms always made Dorothy restless, crueler somehow. And Sam noticed her tension immediately, stepping back, giving her space, telling her he'd see her another day. And that restraint meant more to Ellie than any declaration ever could, and that night, as rain lashed the windows and Dorothy's temper sharpened with it, Ellie realized she was thinking less about escape and more about courage, about whether it was possible to stand her ground without everything falling apart and in the darkness. Listening to the storm and her mother's restless pacing, Ellie whispered Sam's name like a secret prayer, unaware that Dorothy, wide awake in her own room, was already planning how to remove this new threat to her control. Because Dorothy Whitman did not share and she did not lose. By the third week, Dorothy Whitman stopped pretending she hadn't noticed the change. Because control, once threatened, always reveals its sharpest edges, and Ellie felt it in the way her mother corrected her more often, hovered closer, asked questions that weren't really questions at all, and one morning, as Ellie buttoned her coat to take the trash out, Dorothy remarked casually that it was strange how often Samuel Carter seemed to be around lately. Her tone light but her eyes cold, and Ellie's stomach tightened because she knew this game, knew how Dorothy rewrote concern as accusation, and outside the air was crisp and bright, the mountains clear against the sky. And Sam was there near the fence as if summoned by her thoughts, chopping wood with slow, steady movements that felt grounding just to watch. And when he paused and nodded hello, Ellie felt a warmth spread through her chest that scared her almost as much as it comforted her. And they spoke quietly, about nothing important at first, about the weather turning, about how winter lingered longer up the ridge, and then Sam asked her gently if she ever thought about leaving. And the question hit her harder than any insult Dorothy had ever thrown because no one had ever spoken that possibility aloud. And Ellie laughed softly, not from humor but disbelief, saying some lives don't really go anywhere, and Sam didn't argue, didn't dismiss her fear. He just said sometimes staying is harder than leaving. And that sentence followed her back into the house like a shadow, because Dorothy was waiting, her posture rigid, her mouth already set, and she accused Ellie of lingering, of gossiping, of forgetting her duties, reminding her sharply of everything Dorothy had done for her, of sacrifices made, of how ungrateful the world could be to women who didn't know their place. And Ellie felt the old reflex to apologize rise, but it stalled in her throat, replaced by something unfamiliar, a quiet resistance. And instead of apologizing, she simply said she'd taken the trash out, nothing more, nothing less, and Dorothy's eyes narrowed because that was new. Because obedience without explanation had been the rule, and that night Dorothy tightened her grip further, locking doors earlier, inventing errands to keep Ellie busy, criticizing Sam openly now, calling him idle, suspicious, warning that men like him took advantage of lonely women. And Ellie lay awake listening, her heart pounding, torn between fear and anger, because for the first time she recognized the cruelty clearly. Not as discipline or protection but as possession, and days later, when Sam found Ellie alone by the garden and asked why she looked so tired, she surprised herself by telling him the truth, not all of it, but enough. Enough to make her voice shake, and Sam listened without interruption, without pity, his jaw tightening only once, when she mentioned fear, and he said quietly that no one had the right to make her feel small. That mountains taught you something if you listened long enough. That strength wasn't loud, it was steady. And as they stood there, closer than before but not touching, Ellie felt a sense of rightness that frightened her more than Dorothy ever had. Because this feeling asked something of her, asked her to choose, and when Dorothy called her name sharply from the porch, Ellie flinched, instinctively stepping back, and Sam noticed, really noticed. The way fear still ruled her body even when her heart wanted more, and later that evening Dorothy confronted her directly, accusing her of disloyalty, of imagining escape, of forgetting who had raised her. And Ellie finally spoke a sentence she'd never dared before, telling her mother she was tired, just tired, and the room went silent because that small truth cracked something dangerous, and Dorothy's face hardened, not with hurt but with resolve. And in that moment, Ellie understood that loving Sam wouldn't just bring comfort or hope. It would bring a reckoning, and somewhere beyond the darkened house, up in the quiet mountains, Sam Carter stood alone, sensing that the woman he cared for was standing on the edge of something that would change both their lives forever. The reckoning arrived quietly at first, the way storms often do in the mountains, with subtle signs only those paying close attention could feel, and Ellie felt it the moment Dorothy Whitman began waking earlier than usual, already dressed. Already moving with purpose, her questions sharpened into interrogations, her concern curdled into surveillance, and Ellie sensed that every step she took outside the house was being counted, measured, weighed for meaning. And yet Sam Carter remained steady, never rushing her, never demanding bravery she didn't yet have, meeting her instead in small moments stolen from routine. A few words by the fence, a shared smile while passing on the road. The kind of connection that grew not through grand gestures but through patience. And one afternoon, as Ellie stood near the creek collecting smooth stones the way she had as a child, Sam joined her there, keeping his distance, telling her about winters alone in the mountains, about learning how silence could either break you or teach you who you were. And Ellie listened, drawn in by the way he spoke without bitterness, without blame. And she found herself admitting things she'd never said aloud. How she sometimes forgot what her own voice sounded like when it wasn't careful. How she'd stopped imagining a future because it felt safer that way. And Sam told her that fear didn't mean weakness. It meant something mattered, and those words settled deep because Dorothy had always taught her the opposite, had called fear foolish, dreams childish, hope irresponsible. And when Ellie returned home that evening, Dorothy was waiting, arms crossed, the air thick with accusation, and she demanded to know where Ellie had been, why she'd taken so long, who she'd been with. And for the first time, Ellie didn't answer immediately. Didn't rush to soothe her mother's temper, and that pause was enough to ignite Dorothy's rage, quiet but vicious, reminding Ellie of every favor ever granted, every sacrifice exaggerated into a debt, and Ellie felt the old guilt press in. But alongside it came something new, something Sam had awakened, the understanding that love was not supposed to feel like a ledger. And when Ellie finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, telling her mother she'd been by the creek and that she was allowed to take a walk. Dorothy's expression shifted from anger to something colder, calculating, and she warned Ellie that people talked, that reputations were fragile, that women who didn't listen ended up alone and regretting it. And that night Ellie lay awake trembling, torn between terror and resolve, because Dorothy's words still had power, still echoed in her mind, and yet Sam's presence lingered too, grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't imagining the cruelty, that it was real. And the next day Dorothy made her move, showing up unexpectedly at the fence line while Sam was there, her smile brittle, her voice overly polite as she questioned him about his intentions, his work, his past, trying to assert dominance through scrutiny, and Sam met her gaze calmly, answering simply, respectfully, refusing to be intimidated. And Ellie watched in stunned silence as someone finally stood unmoved by Dorothy Whitman. And later, after Dorothy retreated furious but careful, Sam asked Ellie if she was safe, and the question shattered her. Because safety had never been something she'd considered attainable, and in that moment Ellie understood that love was no longer just a feeling growing quietly between them. It was a threat to the order her mother had built, and Dorothy knew it too. Because that evening she tightened the rules again, limiting Ellie's time outdoors, inventing new responsibilities, making escape feel impossible, and yet something irreversible had begun because once you see the truth, once you feel what it's like to be treated with kindness without condition, there is no returning to ignorance. And as Ellie lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks of the house, she realized the mountains no longer felt distant. They felt like a calling, and Sam Carter, patient and unwavering, had become more than a visitor in her days. He had become the measure by which she now understood how wrong everything else had been. The pressure inside the house grew heavier with each passing day, as if Dorothy Whitman sensed time slipping through her fingers and tightened her grip to stop it, and Ellie felt it in the smallest things, the way doors were locked earlier, The way errands were timed, the way Dorothy suddenly needed Ellie close, always close, as if distance itself were a betrayal. And yet outside, beyond the reach of those walls, Sam Carter remained a quiet constant, never pushing, never disappearing. And one late afternoon, when Ellie was sent to hang laundry and the sky burned orange behind the mountains, Sam appeared at the edge of the yard and asked her a simple question that carried enormous weight. Asking her if she was happy, and Ellie froze because happiness had never been part of the equation. Happiness was indulgent, selfish, dangerous, and she tried to answer the way she always did, with neutrality, with careful words, but her voice broke. And Sam didn't step closer, didn't try to fix it. He just said he could see how much she carried, how carefully she moved through the world, and that no one deserved to live as if every breath might be taken away. And those words unlocked something Ellie had kept buried for years. Memories flooding back of moments when she'd wanted more, college brochures hidden in drawers, letters from friends she never answered. A man once who'd asked her to dance only for Dorothy to laugh later and say he wasn't serious. And Ellie felt tears rise, embarrassed and relieved all at once. And when she finally spoke, she told Sam she didn't know how to leave. Didn't know who she'd be without fear guiding her steps. And Sam answered quietly that learning took time, and that no mountain was climbed in one step. And that night Dorothy watched Ellie with narrowed eyes, noticing the redness around them, asking pointed questions about why she looked tired. And Ellie sensed something dangerous building behind her mother's calm. And days later, that danger surfaced when Dorothy announced, without discussion, that Ellie would no longer be taking walks alone, that it wasn't proper, that people misunderstood things. And Ellie felt something snap. A thin thread stretched too far, and she argued softly but firmly, saying she was grown, that she needed air. And Dorothy's reaction was swift and merciless, accusing Ellie of ingratitude, of selfishness, of imagining freedoms that didn't exist, reminding her that she had nowhere else to go. And those words echoed long after the argument ended. Because they were meant to cage her, and for the first time Ellie questioned their truth. Because Sam had never spoken to her as if she were trapped, he spoke as if she were choosing, and that realization frightened her more than the argument itself. And one evening, after Dorothy had gone to bed, Ellie slipped outside quietly, her heart racing, stepping into the cool night air as if crossing a border. And down by the fence, Sam waited, not by arrangement but by instinct. And when he saw her fear, he didn't scold, didn't rush her, he just stood with her under the stars. And in that quiet, Ellie confessed everything. How control had masqueraded as care, how love had always come with conditions. How she feared that choosing happiness would mean losing the only family she'd known. And Sam listened, his face serious, his voice steady when he said love that demanded silence wasn't love at all. And Ellie felt the truth of it settle slowly, painfully. And when she returned to the house later that night, she knew something had changed forever, because fear no longer ruled alone, it now shared space with resolve. And Dorothy, sensing the shift even in sleep, would soon escalate. Because villains like Dorothy Whitman did not loosen control, they tightened it until something broke. The breaking point didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived the way cruelty often does, wrapped in calm certainty. And Ellie sensed it the morning Dorothy Whitman announced plans without asking, speaking as if decisions were facts already settled, saying it would be best if Ellie stopped spending time outside altogether for a while, that too much wandering led to ideas, and ideas led to disappointment. And Ellie felt a cold clarity settle over her, because for the first time she recognized the pattern clearly, saw how every tightening rule followed a moment of hope, how every kindness from Sam was answered by Dorothy with restriction. And something inside Ellie refused to bend this time, refused to apologize for existing, and she replied quietly that she needed fresh air, that she needed space. And Dorothy's reaction was immediate and ruthless. Her voice low and cutting as she reminded Ellie of her dependence, of the roof over her head, of sacrifices made, warning that independence was an illusion sold to foolish women. And Ellie felt the familiar fear rise, but it no longer drowned out everything else, because alongside it stood Sam's steady presence, his words echoing that strength didn't have to be loud to be real. And that afternoon Dorothy crossed a line she couldn't uncross, confronting Sam directly again, this time with accusations thinly veiled as concern, questioning his motives, implying he was filling Ellie's head with dangerous fantasies. And Sam didn't argue, didn't defend himself aggressively. He simply stated calmly that Ellie deserved respect and choice, and Dorothy's eyes hardened because no one spoke to her that way. And later that evening she turned that fury inward, telling Ellie that Sam was no longer welcome near the house, that she would not tolerate corruption under her roof. And Ellie felt something settle into place then, a decision forming not in panic but in clarity. Because for the first time Dorothy had named the truth without realizing it. This was about control, not safety. And that night Ellie packed a small bag in silence, hands shaking but determined, choosing only what mattered, leaving behind what felt like borrowed life. And before dawn she slipped out of the house she had lived in her entire life, each step heavy with grief and relief intertwined, and when she reached the fence line Sam was there as if he'd known. Not smiling, not celebrating, simply opening space for her choice, and Ellie paused, looking back once at the darkened house where fear had shaped her, knowing leaving did not erase the pain but choosing to stay would preserve it forever. And as the sun crept over the mountains Ellie took her first step into a life she would have to learn slowly, imperfectly, bravely, unaware that Dorothy Whitman would not accept this loss quietly. Because villains who lose control rarely retreat, they wait, and the mountains, silent witnesses, held both promise and consequence in their shadows. Ellie Whitman's first days on the mountain were a strange mixture of fear and freedom, the kind of freedom she hadn't known she could feel, and each morning she woke to the crisp air brushing her face, to sunlight spilling over trees and rocks, to a world that asked nothing of her except that she breathe. And Sam Carter was there beside her in quiet companionship, chopping firewood, fetching water from the stream, teaching her slowly how to navigate life in a place that demanded honesty, patience, and physical work. And Ellie discovered muscles she hadn't known she possessed, learned to carry water without trembling, to lift logs without fear, to find joy in small accomplishments. And every time she looked at Sam, steady, kind, unassuming, she realized he had given her something more than safety. He had given her belief in herself, and slowly, through the long afternoons, they spoke of pasts and dreams, of quiet hopes, of stories from Ellie's childhood she had never dared tell anyone, of Sam's life on the mountain before he had met her, and through these conversations a delicate, realistic love began to form, not the sudden, sweeping passion of novels, but the slow, grounded, patient kind that grows from shared work, trust, and understanding. And Ellie felt herself laughing again, hesitantly at first, then more freely, learning to feel sunlight on her skin without flinching, learning that life could be chosen, that love could be steady and kind. And the nights by the fire, with Sam's voice telling tales or describing constellations, the crackle of flames punctuating the silence, became moments Ellie cherished, the kind of moments that teach a heart how to hope again. And gradually Dorothy Whitman's shadow faded from Ellie's mind, replaced by the warmth of a home she had built herself. And as spring bloomed in the high meadows, Ellie and Sam planted a small garden together, laughing at their mistakes, celebrating the small victories, feeling a sense of permanence neither had expected. And on one quiet evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Ellie looked at Sam, feeling gratitude, relief, and joy swirling together. And she realized she had finally arrived in a life that was hers, fully hers, and Sam, smiling softly, took her hand, and they walked back to their cabin together, hearts light, fears behind them, knowing that though the world could be cruel, love could endure and freedom could finally be theirs. And for the first time in decades, Ellie Whitman slept peacefully, wrapped in warmth, laughter, and a love that promised not just hope, but happiness that would last.